Russia is in trouble. Big trouble. You've probably heard that Putin's Russia is a superpower on the rise, a military force to be reckoned with, an economic powerhouse fueled by endless energy resources. Well, that story is completely falling apart. What we're about to share with you isn't just speculation or wishful thinking. These are cold, hard facts that reveal the truth about Russia's unstoppable decline, a collapse happening in real time before our eyes. Buckle up. Some of these facts are so shocking you might think they're made up. They're not. Like how Putin's own TV propagandist suggested he resign on state television, or how Russia's entire emergency fund will vanish by fall 2025. You'll see why China is already relabeling Russian cities with Chinese names, and why experts increasingly worry about who controls the world's largest nuclear arsenal as Russia unravels. But first, let's start with the most humiliating moment in recent Russian history. 1. Kursk invasion shock. In August 2024, Ukraine did something that would have seemed insane just 2 years earlier. They invaded Russia. Not with some massive army either, just 300 soldiers wearing blue tape on their arms crossed the border at 8 a.m. The Russian border guards they met? Most were just scared kids doing their mandatory military service. They took one look at the Ukrainians and surrendered. Within 24 hours, Ukrainian forces were racing toward Sudzha, a town 6 miles inside Russia. 3 days in, they'd pushed to Korovino, 13 miles past the border. By the end of August, Ukraine controlled about 500 square miles of Russian territory. That's an area the size of Los Angeles, but inside Russia. A nuclear superpower, the country with the world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, couldn't stop a few hundred Ukrainian soldiers from capturing its territory. You know what's crazier than Ukraine invading Russian soil? What happened to Russia's once mighty navy? 2. Black Sea Fleet decimation. Remember Russia's prestigious Black Sea Fleet? It's now at the bottom of the sea. Ukraine has destroyed or severely damaged over 25% of Russia's naval force, including its flagship, the Moskva. A country with a severely diminished navy sank Russia's prized warship using Neptune missiles after using drones to distract the ship. The Moskva wasn't just any ship, it was the pride of Russia's fleet, worth over $750 million and packed with advanced weapons systems. Now it's rusting on the seabed. The truly jaw-dropping part? Ukraine doesn't even have a navy to speak of. They're sinking Russian warships with makeshift sea drones controlled by operators sitting in basements hundreds of miles away. The Black Sea Fleet that was supposed to enforce a blockage on Ukraine? It's now hiding by the Crimean Bridge, afraid to venture into open water. And if you think losing ships is bad, wait until you hear about Russia's catastrophic human losses. 3. Russian military losses. The reported figures are indeed staggering. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russian troop losses since February 2024 have surpassed 850,000, encompassing those killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Even if that's high, independent sources confirm at least 95,000 Russians have died in Ukraine as of the 23rd of February 2025. That's more soldiers than Russia lost in 10 years fighting in Afghanistan back in the 1980s. In fact, it's more than Russia lost in all its wars since World War II combined. An entire generation of young Russian men wiped out. The equipment toll? Catastrophic. Ukraine claims Russia's lost at least 370 planes and 331 helicopters. Their tanks? Thousands have been destroyed, abandoned, or captured. Those fancy Russian tanks that were supposed to be unstoppable? They're now scrap metal scattered across Ukraine. But here's where things get really interesting. While Russia's military is getting demolished on the battlefield, something even more unprecedented is happening inside Russia itself. 4. Elite turning on Putin. In Russia, criticizing Putin can get you thrown out a window, literally. That's what makes the events of September 22, 2024 so extraordinary. Vladimir Solovyov, Putin's top TV propagandist, the man awarded the prestigious Order of Honor from Putin himself, went completely off script during his primetime show on Channel 1 Russia. While discussing Ukrainian attacks near Russia's western borders, he suddenly said a resignation is necessary. Did Putin's most loyal mouthpiece just suggest that Putin needs to resign? On state TV? The one Putin controls? The studio fell silent. His co-host froze. Someone gasped audibly in the background. This wasn't a one-off blunder. During another broadcast, Solovyov calmly declared that Russia's political system would survive without Putin. He's talking about a post-Putin Russia as if it's almost inevitable. When the regime's loudest cheerleaders start hedging their bets, you know the ship is sinking. And it's not just the elites who are turning on Putin. 5. Growing internal protests. For years, Russians who protested the regime disappeared in the prisons. Speaking out meant losing everything. Something fundamental has shifted. Since 2022, Russia has seen significant anti-war protests, despite facing brutal crackdowns. Thousands have been arrested for participating in these demonstrations, which have continued despite severe repression. The protests reflect a broader trend of dissent within Russia, though specific data on overall protest increases is not detailed in the available information. In the village of Olgovka, near Ukraine, residents wrote an open letter to Putin himself. "We ask you to end this cursed war," they wrote. "We've been living in hell over the past 3 months." Regular Russians living inside Russia publicly calling Putin's war cursed. The kind of statement that once guaranteed a one-way ticket to Siberia. Now people are saying it anyway. Even Russian military brass are breaking ranks. General Andrei Gurulev, who sits in Russia's parliament, confessed that border troops had no intelligence assets. They were flying blind, no idea what was coming or how to stop it. These aren't just isolated complaints, they're symptoms of a system coming apart at the seams. And behind Russia's political problems lurks an even more devastating reality. Its money is running out. 6. Wealth fund depletion. Russia's been saving for a rainy day. Well, it's pouring now and the piggy bank is almost empty. The National Wealth Fund, Russia's emergency money stash, has crashed from $117 billion in 2021 to just $31 billion by the end of 2024. Strip away the gold, and that figure shrinks even further. At the current burn rate, experts predict Russia's liquid reserves will be completely gone by fall 2025. Not diminished, gone, empty, zero. And yet Russia plans to spend over $145 billion on defense in 2025 alone. It's like draining your retirement account to buy a tank while your house is burning down. As Russia's financial safety net vanishes, a different kind of crisis is killing the country from within. The solution to Russia's problems? For millions, it's at the bottom of a bottle. 7. Vodka consumption crisis. Russians are drowning in alcohol. Between January and October 2024 alone, Russians guzzled 1.84 billion liters of alcohol, the highest volume recorded since 2017. Fill 736 Olympic-sized swimming pools with booze, and you'd still have Russians lining up for more. Vodka, Russia's national drink and silent killer, leads the charge. In just 10 months, Russians downed 620 million liters of the stuff. Russian men now die on average 10 years earlier than Russian women, creating one of the worst gender gaps in life expectancy worldwide. A quarter of all male deaths directly trace back to alcohol. This isn't just bad health policy. For centuries, Russian rulers have deliberately fueled mass alcoholism to keep their people docile, obedient, and too drunk to revolt. Putin keeps this tradition alive. As vodka kills individual Russians, it's simultaneously killing Russia's future as a nation. But alcohol isn't the only reason Russia is vanishing before our eyes. 8. Demographic freefall. Russia's birth rate has nosedived to its lowest level in 25 years, just 11.108 births per 1,000 people in 2024. The war has turned this slow decline into a demographic emergency. When Putin called up 300,000 men for his partial mobilization in 2022, about 700,000 young Russians, mostly men, immediately fled the country. Not random Russians either. These were doctors, engineers, tech experts, the very people who typically start families and build economies. The math is brutal. For every 12 to 13 people who die in Russia, only about 8 babies are born. This isn't a temporary dip, it's a population extinction event. Putin's desperate solution? Import workers from other countries. Russia now relies on 6 to 14 million migrant workers, mostly from Central Asian countries. The Russians actually being born face a future in a country where basic services are collapsing, and nothing shows Russia's decay more clearly than what's happened to its once proud healthcare system. 9. Healthcare collapse. Getting sick in Russia today? You might as well try medieval medicine. A stunning 40% of Russian medical facilities lack even basic equipment. Rural hospitals stand abandoned, with doctors fleeing for better opportunities. Countless remote villages have zero medical care. War has accelerated this breakdown. Critical medical supplies get diverted to the front, leaving civilian hospitals empty-handed. Doctors face conscription, forcing clinics to shutter. In some regions, patients must bring their own painkillers, bandages, and even surgical tools to the hospital. Before the war, Russians could at least import Western medicines. Now, with sanctions biting hard, even basic drugs have vanished. Cancer patients die waiting for chemotherapy. Diabetics search frantically for insulin. But healthcare isn't the only system in crisis. Russia's entire economy is burning to the ground. 10. Rampant inflation. Russia's economy isn't just struggling, it's melting down. Official data claims inflation at 9.5% in December 2024. Independent research tells a vastly different story. Romir, a Russian research firm, found prices of essential goods jumped by 22% in September 2024 alone. The Central Bank of Russia has jacked interest rates to 21%, more than 4 times higher than American rates. When a country resorts to rates that extreme, it's like using a defibrillator on a failing economy. For ordinary Russians, this means homebuyers face interest rates approaching 30%. Millions find themselves trapped under loans they'll never repay. Each ruble printed for the war effort accelerates this inflationary spiral, crushing everyday Russians under rising prices. As the economy burns, those who can are abandoning ship, and Russia is losing its brightest minds at a terrifying pace. 11. Brain drain exodus. Russia is experiencing the greatest exodus of talent in its history. Over 1 million Russians fled after the invasion began. Not refugees from poverty, but the country's best and brightest. About 100,000 were tech workers, effectively Russia's digital future, gone. Imagine Silicon Valley just vanishing overnight. Dubai alone now hosts roughly 700,000 Russians. These weren't random citizens. They were Russia's future innovators, entrepreneurs, and professionals, the very people who could have helped Russia navigate sanctions and build new industries. Now they're developing apps in Armenia, launching startups in Turkey, and building new lives far from Putin's reach. Their departure doesn't just hurt Russia's economy, it exposes deeper fissures in the Federation. Because contrary to what most people believe, Russia isn't really one country at all. 12. Separatist movements. Russia isn't a single country, it's a patchwork of over 190 different ethnic groups speaking more than 100 languages, many never voluntarily joining Russia. At least 5 Russian regions now actively discuss independence. Putin banned separatism in 2013, a fear response to a threat he knew was real. Chechnya fought 2 bloody wars trying to break free. Tatarstan declared a sovereignty decades ago. Siberian independence movements simmer beneath the surface. Even Karelia, bordering Finland, shows separatist stirrings. The Kursk invasion demonstrated Russia's vulnerability. These regions are watching carefully, calculating when to make their move. These separatist impulses connect directly to one of Putin's most shameful policies, and it's one that could tear Russia apart. 13. Ethnic disparity in war deaths. Putin has a dirty secret. He's sacrificing ethnic minorities to save ethnic Russians. Independent journalists uncovered a shocking pattern. A young man from regions like Tuva or Buryatia, predominantly non-Russian ethnic regions, is about 10 times more likely to die in Ukraine than someone from Moscow. Buryatia, a small Siberian region, has lost more men in Ukraine than regions 10 times its size. Dagestan's local activists have counted more military deaths than the Russian government admits for the entire country. Why? Putin's military machine deliberately targets Russia's poorest non-Russian regions, where economic desperation makes military service one of the few available careers. This ethnic sacrifice policy creates a dangerous vulnerability in Russia's geography, and Russia's massive size, once its greatest strength, has become its Achilles heel. 14. Geographic vulnerability. Russia's size has become its greatest weakness. Spanning 11% of Earth's land surface, 1.8 times bigger than America, Russia simply lacks the population to properly secure its vast territory. This enormous landmass stretches across 11 time zones, from NATO in the west to China in the east. Russia's population increasingly clusters in the western regions, abandoning the eastern expanses. In Russia's far east, bordering China, once thriving villages stand abandoned. Meanwhile, just across the border, Chinese cities boom with activity and growth. Chinese maps have started relabeling Russian cities with their historical Chinese names. Water-hungry China eyes Siberia's lakes with growing interest. Putin wants to rebuild the Russian Empire but lacks the Russians to hold the territory he already has. As Russia's geography becomes indefensible, its military equipment inventory is vanishing, and the losses are staggering. 15. Military equipment losses. Russia is hemorrhaging war machines at a pace unprecedented in modern warfare. Since February 2022, over 20,000 pieces of military equipment have been destroyed in Ukraine. That includes 10,325 tanks, 24,561 artillery systems, and 1,104 air defense systems. The losses forced Russia to pull 60-year-old tanks from storage, museum pieces pressed into combat because modern replacements don't exist. Each destroyed tank or aircraft represents billions of rubles and years of manufacturing time that Russia simply cannot replace quickly. Even if the war ended tomorrow and all sanctions lifted, rebuilding Russia's military to pre-war capabilities would take decades, with money Russia doesn't have. This equipment crisis has forced Russia to seek help from a country that's slowly consuming it, and China isn't exactly being charitable. 16. China's economic domination. The Russia-China partnership has transformed into economic colonization. Before the war, Russia acted like China's equal. Those days are history. When Western sanctions hit, Putin turned to China as his economic lifeline. China now purchases half of Russia's oil exports. The catch? China dictates the terms completely. A 2023 deal lets China buy Russian natural gas at nearly 50% below market rates. That's not partnership, it's exploitation. Even Chinese banks have started distancing themselves from Russia, fearing Western secondary sanctions. Russia has developed from world power to China's discount gas station in just 2 years. As China squeezes Russia economically, Putin bleeds his own people to fund his failed war, and the cuts are getting deeper every year. 17. Military budget cannibalizing social spending. Russia's national priorities are written in its budget, war above everything. In 2025, military and security spending will consume over 43% of Russia's national budget. Defense alone will devour 12.3 trillion rubles, $145 billion, jumping 22.2% from 2024. This represents the single largest expenditure in Russia's budget, swallowing nearly a third of all government spending. The kicker? About 85% of that defense budget remains classified, hidden from public scrutiny, the black hole feeding Putin's Ukraine disaster. What's getting sacrificed? Everything else. Healthcare, education, and public services face budget cuts of 16% compared to last year. This military-first approach might make sense for a healthy economy, But Russia's economy suffers from a terminal condition, one that's been decades in the making. 18. Economic Dutch disease. Russia's economy has terminal Dutch disease, a condition where over-reliance on natural resources hollows out all other sectors. For decades, Russia exported oil and gas while neglecting manufacturing, technology, and agriculture. The result? A dangerously unbalanced economy. Between 2022 and 2024, Russian fuel export revenue plummeted from $1,360 million to $820 million per day, a 40% freefall. Yet Russia remains pathologically dependent on these resources. The Russian car market now consists of 60% Chinese vehicles, up from just 9% before the invasion. Tractors, computers, smartphones. Russia imports virtually everything it needs. A country that can't produce essential goods isn't independent. It's perpetually vulnerable to external pressure. As this resource addiction deepens, Russia faces another existential threat, one that undermines its very ability to function. 19. Worker shortage crisis. Russia is running out of people to keep the lights on. The working age population has declined by approximately 800,000 people annually since 2010. Add war casualties and mass emigration, and you've got a workforce in freefall. Companies have resorted to hiring prison inmates. The military recruits 60-year-olds. Officials court migrants from Central Asia with expedited citizenship, the same populations they previously vilified. In Kurgan, where Russian armored vehicles are manufactured, wages spiked 33%. The problem isn't paying workers, it's finding them at all. Key industries struggle to maintain basic operations. Innovation? Forget about it. The labor crisis hits one sector with particular severity, the very industry Russia needs most right now. 20. Weapons production constraints. Russia's weapons factories are maxed out and breaking down. Industrial facilities are operating below full capacity, with 73% of enterprises facing severe labor shortages. There simply aren't enough people or resources to keep the weapons flowing to the front. Russia has doubled armored vehicle production and ramped up ammunition output fivefold, but it's still not enough to replace battlefield losses. This pace is unsustainable. Factories work 24/7, equipment breaks down, and quality control suffers. Some captured Russian weapons show signs of hasty production and substandard materials. Tanks arrive at the front with crucial components missing. Missiles fail mid-flight. Russia can produce quantity, but not quality. And in modern warfare, quality matters more than ever. And here's the real kicker. Much of the money meant for these weapons never makes it to production, because Russia is rotting from within. 21. Corruption stranglehold. On the Transparency International Corruption Index, Russia ranks a dismal 137th out of 180 countries. But even that doesn't capture how deeply corruption has infected every level of Russian society. An estimated 30% of military funding never reaches its intended purpose. Instead, it disappears into the pockets of officials, generals, and oligarchs. That new tank only exists on paper. Those advanced missiles, the money went to someone's yacht instead. This isn't just about greed, it's about a system that cannot function honestly. From the highest levels of government to the lowliest traffic cop, everyone takes their cut. Nothing happens without bribes. When Ukrainian forces captured Russian positions, they found soldiers equipped with cheap Chinese radios instead of military-grade communication devices. The money for proper equipment had been stolen long ago. This rampant corruption has consequences beyond just wasted money. It's eroding what's left of Russia's global power and its currency. 22. Ruble collapse. Remember when the ruble was worth something? Those days are gone. In late November 2024, the ruble suffered a catastrophic drop, plunging to 114 per US dollar. That's less than a penny per ruble, a currency so worthless you could wallpaper your house with it. Despite desperate interventions by Russia's central bank, the damage was done. For the year, the ruble tumbled 20% against the dollar, with 9% of that coming in just 1 week. when the U.S. blacklisted 50 Russian banks, including Gazprom Bank, the ruble went into freefall. Moscow tried everything: capital controls, foreign currency interventions, sky-high interest rates. Nothing worked. Half of Russia's foreign exchange reserves remain frozen due to Western sanctions, limiting its ability to stabilize the currency. The ruble briefly rebounded in early 2025, clawing back to just under 100 per dollar. But even this temporary lifeline can't save a currency that fundamentally has nothing going for it. Foreign investment is non-existent, exports are constrained, and Moscow is running out of tools to keep its currency afloat. As Russia's currency crumbles, so does another pillar of Putin's power: his absolute control over the security forces. 23. Wagner Rebellion exposure. In June 2023, Russia witnessed something unthinkable: an armed rebellion against Putin himself. Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the Wagner mercenary group and Putin's former ally, led his forces toward Moscow. At the height of the rebellion, Wagner troops seized Rostov-on-Don, a major military hub, and advanced to within 124 miles of the capital. What's truly shocking? They faced almost no resistance. Border guards failed to halt the march. Military generals chose to have coffee with Prigozhin rather than defending the state. Why wasn't Prigozhin stopped? Reports suggest military leaders feared repercussions if they opposed him. They believed he might actually succeed. Putin's silence during the initial chaos was deafening. When a leader who's built his image on strength and control suddenly disappears during a crisis, it reveals the truth: his power is more fragile than anyone realized. While the rebellion ultimately failed and Prigozhin died in a suspicious plane crash 2 months later, the damage was done. Russians saw that Putin's grip on power could be challenged. The Wagner rebellion exposed cracks in Putin's power, but an even more alarming threat looms on the horizon, one that could spark widespread civil unrest. 24. Renewed conscription fear. Russians are terrified that another wave of forced military service is coming. Despite constant denials from the Kremlin, signs point to a new mass mobilization in early 2025. Military recruitment offices are updating their draft lists. Employers are being asked to identify eligible men. Border restrictions for fighting-age males are tightening. Russians remember the chaotic partial mobilization in September 2022 that prompted a mass exodus. Men were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. Some received draft notices with no prior military experience or training. This time, the resistance will be fiercer. Underground networks have formed to help men avoid service. Corrupt officials sell medical exemptions for thousands of dollars. Some young men have even resorted to self-harm to avoid being sent to the front. Russian lawmakers are scrambling to calm public fears, refuting rumors of new conscription drives, a clear indication they recognize the growing unrest. If Putin orders another mobilization, it could be the spark that ignites widespread civil disobedience. The question isn't whether Russians will resist, it's how violently the state will respond. And this brings us to perhaps the most alarming fact of all, one that should keep the entire world awake at night. 25. Nuclear concern. Russia's collapse raises a terrifying question. What happens to the world's largest nuclear arsenal when a country falls apart? Russia maintains approximately 5,889 nuclear warheads as of 2024. The safe maintenance and control of these weapons requires a stable, skilled workforce of nuclear technicians, military officials, and security personnel. As alcoholism, economic collapse, and war decimate Russia's working-age male population, precisely the demographic that staffs these facilities, the risks of accidents, miscalculations, or security breaches grow substantially. A 2023 report by the Atlantic Council warned that Russia's demographic crisis, exacerbated by alcoholism, creates unpredictable dynamics within a nuclear power. As Russia's conventional military capabilities decline, the country might become more reliant on its nuclear deterrent, a concerning prospect for global security. But there's an even darker possibility. What happens if Russia's collapse leads to a power struggle, with different factions fighting for control of nuclear weapons, or if separatist regions housing nuclear facilities declare independence. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 left nuclear weapons scattered across newly independent states. We could be headed for a similar scenario, but in a much more chaotic and dangerous context. Russia isn't just experiencing temporary setbacks, it's facing systemic collapse on multiple fronts simultaneously. Military defeats, economic freefall, demographic disaster, and political instability are converging to create a perfect storm. Putin's regime may be able to maintain control in the short term through repression and propaganda, but the foundations are crumbling and the collapse, when it comes, will be rapid and dramatic. The question isn't whether Russia will collapse, but when, and how much damage it will do to itself and the world in its death throes. What do you think? Which of these facts surprised you the most? Is Russia's collapse inevitable, or can it somehow pull back from the brink? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our video on Forget Ukraine. This is what will destroy Russia, and make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. Thanks for watching. June 27, 2025. Putin announces a shocking 3-year plan to cut military spending, right after Russia hits 1 million war casualties. Here's why this move could end his regime. It's a stunning reversal from a leader who, not long ago, appeared to have regained his footing. Sure, his special military operation had made Russia the most sanctioned country on the planet, but with China helping to stabilize his collapsing economy and his forces managing to claw back territory in Ukraine, it looked like Putin had weathered the geopolitical storm just enough to maintain his grip on power. Or so it seemed. Now, that carefully constructed image is beginning to unravel. Something is going very wrong on the home front, and it's no longer staying off the battlefield. And the first real crack? It's not showing up in the trenches, but in the budget. It's not normal for a country that just passed the 1 million casualty mark in a war to cut back on military spending. But that's exactly what Putin just said he would do. On June 27th, he announced a 3-year plan to reduce the money going to the Russian armed forces. According to him, the reduction will start next year. He didn't pass up the chance to throw a few rhetorical jabs NATO's way. The Western observers were quick to roll their eyes. Normally, they'd be right to doubt him. But this time feels different, and that's what makes it dangerous. When both his economy minister and the CEO of Sberbank publicly warn of a looming recession, even Putin can't keep up the illusion. Like his Soviet predecessors, he only tells the truth when reality is too big to spin. So what forced his hand? Turn back the clock to 10 days earlier. On the 17th, Russia's economy minister, Maxim Reshetnikov, warned that Russia was on the verge of going into recession again. Then, on June 20th, another voice joined the chorus, Sberbank CEO German Gref, who said that a perfect storm could soon barrel down on the Russian economy. Putin only admitted the troubling news because it was already out there. So what's the financial weather forecast like in Moscow? Start by looking far away, to the oil and gas fields deep in the Russian interior. Things out here aren't as great as they used to be, and that's really bad. Oil and gas revenues account for about 20% of Russia's GDP and between 30 and 50% of its federal budget. Now those revenues are in trouble for 2 reasons. First, crude oil prices have hit their lowest level since 2021 thanks to increased production from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. The decline in energy prices partially ensured that Russia's oil and gas revenue fell by 35% between May 2024 and May 2025. Russia has taxes on the extraction of oil and gas, too, and those revenues are also down sharply. They fell by 28% between April 2024 and April 2025. Russia's Ministry of Finance estimates the country has lost 1.7% in GDP growth because of these developments. That's a big problem when Russia has a war to finance. Artillery shells, tanks, missiles, and all the pensions for dead and wounded soldiers don't exactly pay for themselves. It costs $50,000 a year just to keep one soldier in the field. War-related expenses amount to 6.3% of Russia's GDP in 2025, a third of Russia's entire federal budget. So how do you pay for all that stuff if you're a dictator and your top export isn't selling like it used to? The answer can be found in the way Russia is treating its men. No, not the men being sent out to Ukraine as cannon fodder. Rather, take a look at the ones back home. They're lucky in comparison, but in Putin's Russia, your luck can only go so far. So many men are needed to fill Putin's insatiable demand for manpower in Ukraine that it means the ones left behind in Russia are making much more money than they used to. The unemployment rate is only 2%. That can only mean one thing: average wages are up a lot. They rose 15% in just a month to 97,375 rubles between April and May 2025. It all sounds great. See a headline like that, and you might think that the war is making Russia a pretty good place to work. There's just one problem. Russian workers aren't getting more rubles, not because they're more productive, but because their leader is claiming a trophy nobody wants in order to finance his war. When it comes to the yearly inflation rate, Russia is now the world's gold medalist, with a 9.9% rise in prices between May 2024 and May 2025. Things are so bad that Russia's central bank has set a yearly inflation target of 4%, twice what the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank considers to be good form. Those higher wages for Russia's workforce? It just means that there are more rubles chasing goods and services in a civilian economy that can't grow nearly as fast thanks to war expenditures and sanctions. So there's only one direction that prices can go. Just go around and talk to the people in Russia and they'll tell you about it, though not all of them are responding in the same way. Some are putting on a brave face. Older ones will say that there's nothing compared to the post-Soviet economic chaos of the 1990s. But others are more honest. They complain that they can't even afford potatoes or cherries now. Even bread is getting hard for ordinary Russians to reach. Prices have gone up by 35% since their leader decided to launch the special military operation, and by 14.6% in just the last year. How's the Russian government responding to this? One way is with a measure that's been a failure since the Roman Empire struggled with inflation: price controls. Moscow's already done that with eggs, so now Russians don't get to eat as many of the eggs you or me are used to. Go shopping in Russia and you might consider yourself lucky if you come across a carton of actual eggs. A cheap liquid egg product has emerged instead. Now the same thing is happening with bread. Well, it's not quite the same. The bread is at least still solid, but the stores are now selling it in the form of a single slice cut in two, put in a plastic bag, and priced at 23 rubles. There are videos of the phenomenon going viral on social media. That's the reality for people in Putin's Russia now. The most recent inflationary blow comes from new housing and utility increases. The bills went up by 12% starting on July 1st. No word on price controls there yet. As Russians have seen clearly, price controls don't work to control inflation. High interest rates do, and they're seeing those too. So the Bank of Russia has decided to provide relief, sort of. In June 2025, it made the decision to cut interest rates from 21% to 20%. For Russia, keeping rates this high is probably a necessity. Who knows how high inflation would have gotten otherwise? Putin isn't likely to, but in trying to solve one problem, he's only creating another. Since interest rates are so high, Russia's civilian businesses just can't make the investments that they used to, and existing enterprises are much less profitable. Remember those bakeries that need to raise the price of bread? Well, these are the types of businesses that are particularly vulnerable to high interest rates because they run on such narrow profit margins. They can't afford to take any new loans with interest rates so high, especially when the cost of raw materials, labor, and transport has gone up. So the only way they can stay in business is raise prices for lower quality, cost-cutting products. The problems in Russia's economy don't stop there. There's another new price that these businesses and workers need to pay as well, and unlike interest rates, it won't do anything to help with inflation. Russia isn't a country that's used to persistent large budget deficits, but that's what it's been dealing with since the war started. Deficits amounted to 2.51% of GDP in 2023 and 2.25% in 2024 as war spending ramped up. The deficit is projected to shrink to 1% of GDP this year, though, but only because the Ministry of Finance just implemented sweeping tax increases. For the first time, the country has a progressive income tax. There are 4 brackets, starting at 15% for those earning at least 2.4 million rubles per year and ending at 22% for those making over 50 million. Corporate taxes were also raised from 20 to 25%. The new taxes could, in theory, help to ease inflationary pressures, but that wasn't Putin's objective. That money is going out, and we all know where it'll wind up. More spending on the military, meaning more money in the economy, meaning higher prices anyway, all while businesses have less money to invest in creating new wealth. So Russia's civilian economy is in pretty dire straits. But Russia isn't just sitting there taking these economic hits passively. Putin's got another card to play, one that Western intelligence has been scrambling to shut down for months: sanctions evasion. And Russia's gotten frighteningly good at it. Think of it like this: you're trying to starve someone out, but they keep finding secret tunnels to smuggle in food. That's exactly what Russia's been doing with Western technology and critical components. And the scale? It's massive. About 70% of machine tool imports and 90% of microelectronics imports to Russia arrive from China. We're talking about the exact components Russia needs to build tanks, missiles, and maintain its war machine. But here's the twist: China isn't supposed to be selling this stuff to Russia directly. So how's it happening? Welcome to the world of shell companies and midnight logistics. Since at least summer 2024, officials at a bank in Kyrgyzstan have been coordinating with Russian officials to implement what can only be described as a financial laundering operation that would make a drug cartel jealous. In January 2025 alone, the United States sanctioned hundreds of enablers spread across multiple countries. These aren't just a few rogue companies. We're talking about massive international networks specifically designed to keep Putin's war machine running. Armenian exports to Russia tripled in 2022, reaching $2.4 billion. In 2023, they rose by 43%, hitting a historical high of $3.4 billion. Armenia suddenly became a major exporter of high-tech equipment? Come on, we all know where the gear is really coming from. Kazakhstan saw similar spikes. Trade with Russia reached $27 billion in 2023. Exports of nuclear reactors and mechanical devices soared tenfold. Optical instruments and medical equipment grew fivefold. Every time the West shuts down one pathway, Russia opens three more. But here's the catch, and this brings us back to Putin's budget crisis. Thanks to the unprecedented sanctions regime, Russia is spending a fortune to work around restrictions. What used to cost $100 might now cost $300 or $400 through these elaborate shell company networks. That's money that could have gone to soldiers' salaries, equipment maintenance, or economic development. Instead, it's disappearing into the pockets of middlemen in Cyprus, Kazakhstan, and Armenia. The cat and mouse game escalated dramatically this year. Treasury Department actions in 2025 have targeted everything from Chinese microelectronics suppliers to Turkish logistics companies to Swiss financial facilitators. Russia's response? Even more complex schemes involving third-party banks and cryptocurrency transactions. It's working, sort of. Russia is still getting critical components, but it's bleeding money to do it. And when you're already hemorrhaging cash on high interest rates, inflation, and war spending, these evasion costs are becoming unbearable. So, with his civilian economy in shambles and sanctions bleeding him dry, Putin needed yet another trick up his sleeve. Don't worry, Putin has another answer for that, or at least he thought he did. He's taken to manipulating the ruble to stabilize Russia's finances. Russia's currency has been on a wild ride since the invasion began. You probably remember the early days in the war when the ruble tumbled to its weakest recorded exchange rate against the US dollar. On March 10, 2022, 135.8 rubles equaled $1. Something needed to be done, so Putin came to the rescue with the magic show. His bag of financial magic tricks included those high interest rates, a mandate that exporters convert a certain percentage of their hard currency into rubles. The mandate started at 80%, forcing foreign customers to pay for Russian energy products in rubles to create a baseline demand for its currency and strict capital controls. The government banned brokers from selling foreign-owned securities like corporate shares in Russian companies and government bonds to prevent a collapse in prices. But these efforts were highly specific. Putin's goal isn't to strengthen the ruble for its own sake. A weak ruble is actually one of Russia's best friends. It means that exports, especially energy, well, let's be honest, it's pretty much just energy, are more competitive. So the goal of Putin's magic show was to prevent a complete collapse of Russia's currency, but keep it just weak enough for him to be able to sell oil and gas to customers at a price they'd find valuable and keep demand steady. And for a while, it looked like he did just that. Lo and behold, the ruble stabilized at an exchange rate of around 90 to 100 to the dollar between the middle of 2023 and November 2024. Economic growth during that time was healthy and the war machine kept rolling on. But something strange has happened recently. In November 2024, the United States slapped dramatic new sanctions on Gazprombank. Putin had ordered European customers for Russian energy to settle their accounts in rubles through this bank, the last major unsanctioned financial institution in Russia. Not anymore. The bank could no longer handle transactions with any entities that had a relationship with America's financial system. The news sent the ruble's value tumbling again between November and January, back to over 100 rubles to a dollar. So Putin seemed to reverse course. He said that his few remaining European energy customers don't have to pay for their product in rubles through Gazprombank anymore. Instead, they could pay in a way that was suitable for both the Russian supplier and the foreign buyer. But that's not the strange part. The ruble did indeed recover from this latest collapse, just not in the way that Putin wanted. Look at the chart. The ruble didn't return to the stable trend seen in 2023 and 2024. Instead, it's now stronger than at any point in the last 2 years. Remember when we said that there was a second reason why Russia's oil revenues are in trouble? This is it. In fact, when it comes to currencies in 2025, Bank of America says the ruble is actually your best investment, with gains of over 40%. Why? Well, the US dollar weakened, but Putin can't just lay the blame on the Americans this time, at least not privately. The high interest rates coming from his military spending spree are now helping to do that too. Russian businesses have little choice but to sit on their rubles now, which lowers demand for foreign currency, and those capital controls Putin put in place to keep the ruble strong are now starting to work too well. What's going to happen when you force exporters to bring part of the money they earn abroad back into the country and convert the foreign currency into rubles? Naturally, the ruble strengthens due to the demand, and then the next round of exports gets less competitive. Russia may have bounded out of its war recession by April 2023, but that's now starting to look like a sugar high fueled by the likes of China taking advantage of cheap Russian energy prices. Now that there's not as much demand, the cracks in the foundation are starting to show. Russia's economic growth has slowed sharply. The average GDP growth over the first 4 months of 2025 was only 1.1%. It was 5.3% over the same period in 2024. Putin vows that he won't let the Russian economy enter another recession under any circumstances. But how can he keep his word with all these problems piling up? There are only 3 realistic choices. He can end the war, apologize for everything, and give Ukraine its territory back. That might reset relations with the West and get the sanctions lifted. But he probably doesn't want to do that because it would also mean he'd take a permanent Siberian vacation or get exiled to China. And that's probably the reason why he again said that Ukrainians didn't exist as a people and that all of Ukraine was Russia's. Not coincidentally, he said this in the same meeting where he vowed Russia wouldn't go into recession. So option 1 isn't going to happen. Option 2, increase revenues from energy exports to cooperating countries like China, India, and Turkey. That's something he can't control as easily as he can control the news in Russia that says everything is fine. So on to door number 3, cut spending to get inflation under control. But where to cut? Only one place stands out, and that's the bloated military budget. It's almost certainly not a coincidence that he said he would cut the spending on the armed forces over the course of 3 years, beginning in 2026. That's the exact timeline Sberbank CEO said that the Russian economy would be most endangered. It's also the exact timeline when Britain's Royal United Services Institute said that the Russian military would become seriously degraded thanks to casualties and the exhaustion of usable equipment. That prediction came in February 2024, and it's happening right on schedule. Sure, Russia has proven far more resilient than the West gave it credit for. All the inflation and high interest rates came for a reason. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte had to admit that Russia produces more ammunition than the entire alliance. A lot more. More ammunition in 3 months than NATO puts out in a year. But when it comes to Russia's vaunted tank fleet, things are different. In January 2024, the UK Ministry of Defense estimated that Russia was producing 100 new tanks a month. A year and a half later, Ukrainian security experts estimate that the number has dropped to between 30 and 35 a month. Why? They're watching a piece of media that Putin can't manipulate, the satellite images of Russia's tank facilities and repair shops, and by the end of May, the pattern became undeniable. Far fewer units were coming in for upkeep than there were a year earlier. You can find further proof in the flaming tank wrecks littering the soil of Ukraine. Russia has lost a staggering number of tanks since the war started. The Oryx blog estimates at least 4,059 tanks have been destroyed, damaged, captured, or abandoned based on visually confirmed losses. That's 32% of its total tank fleet. But those losses declined in 2025, even though Russia has been on a costly offensive all year. Ukrainian security experts estimated that Russia lost between 300 and 400 tanks per month between September and November 2024. As the new year began, the number dropped to between 200 and 240 tanks a month. That isn't because Russia's finally become more competent at using its tanks. Rather, there's just less tanks available for Russia to lose. And Russia's tanks aren't the only things in trouble. Russia just suffered a huge embarrassment. Between May and June, Ukrainian forces damaged 15 air defense systems in Crimea, attacking S-300, S-350, and S-400 units. Dozens of launchers, 15 radar stations, and over 10 control points had all been destroyed in what is supposedly one of the most heavily fortified pieces of land in the world. These are systems that Russia can't replace so easily. The S-400 in particular cost about $600 million apiece. It's not simply a matter of importing the electronic components from China to get around sanctions. Russia simply doesn't have a productive or financial capacity to produce these systems at scale anymore. Otherwise, Putin wouldn't be admitting economic trouble. Missile attacks on Ukrainian cities continue under high intensity, but they won't end the war. Russia's offensive this year looks less like a coordinated strategy and more like a last-ditch effort to grab as much land as possible so that Putin can say he accomplished something, anything for him to stay in power, even if it's far short of his rhetoric. He might be a dictator, but unfortunately for him, long-term realities in the economy and on the battlefield aren't as easy to manipulate as his country's media. With tanks failing, air defenses crumbling, and inflation rising, how much longer can Putin's economy hold out? Tell us in the comments below. Thanks for joining us today, and if you liked the video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. It makes a difference. See you next time.
Putin didn't just invade Ukraine, he's now invading Russia. One draft notice, one border closure, one terrifying young man at a time. The war isn't just at the front anymore, it's at the nightclub, the gym, the train station. Because in Putin's Russia, if you're a man between 18 and 30, every outing could be your last as a civilian. Step into the wrong metro station, and a facial recognition camera might flag you. Step into the wrong bar, and the cops might drag you out. Straight to the trenches. This is a country at war with itself. And while the Kremlin pretends this isn't a mobilization, everything from border bans to secret draft laws says otherwise. Russia is broke. The bonuses for soldiers are vanishing. The bodies are piling up. And now Putin has only one option left: trap his own people and squeeze them for blood. This is the collapse no one talks about, because it isn't just military, it's psychological. Russia is becoming a prison, not just in a metaphor, but in law. And the scariest part? Most Russians still don't realize they're already locked in. Let's break down the full story. Putin and Kim Jong-un are BFFs these days, and Putin might be feeling a little inspired, because Russia is looking more and more like North Korea. In October 2025, the State Duma began to consider a new proposal. Andrei Kovalenko, head of Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, called it a new Iron Curtain. If the law goes through, Russian nationals will no longer be allowed to travel to NATO countries during wartime, unless they can pay, of course. For everyone else, closed airports, expensive tickets, and domestic tourism in the style of North Korea, he said. What's going on? Well, there's already a law that bans Russian men who've been called up to the military from leaving the country. That law came on the books in August of 2023. The moment they get the draft notice, they're on the hook. Failure to comply can mean the loss of driver's licenses, a ban on selling property, and a permanent stay in the motherland. And that's just the least of it. But first things first, you might not like it, but it makes sense on some level. There has to be some sort of punishment for violating national draft laws, or else the country might face manpower shortages in the war. In the United States, all men who turn 18 still have to register for the Selective Service System on penalty of a felony conviction that carries a $250,000 fine and 5 years in the slammer. Ukraine also banned all men ages 18 to 60 from leaving the country in February of 2022. Just like that. But Russia is taking things a big step further. Putin suffered an embarrassment when around 600,000 well-educated Russian men hightailed it out of the motherland. Once he called reservists to the colors in 2022, that was it. They were out of there. And actually, that was just the second act. More than 1 million Russians crossed the border between their country and Georgia between March and November of 2022. It all rattled Putin. He needed to do something. Again, that's normal for a country at war, no matter the justification for the war. In the first half of 2025, Russians made 13.7 million trips overseas. Turkey was the most popular destination. 19% of those trips were across the Black Sea. This apparently bothered Putin's government enough that the Duma is now considering passing the law. Maybe too many of them are taking a permanent vacation. With well over 1 million casualties and counting, Putin's running out of options. He needs manpower badly. He can't let the potential pool of recruits get ideas about staying in Turkey for too long. For Russian citizens, though, the law would only close the loop. The ones that get out are already lucky. Here's where the similarities with the United States and Ukraine end. The ones with certain other countries begin. But before we get into them, please consider subscribing. It helps us keep talking about stories like this that are too complicated for your nightly news broadcast or social media feed. Kim Jong-un took full advantage of the pandemic to tighten his grip on the North Korean people, as if that was even possible. Turns out it was. He was already building electrified fences to keep them in. But then he made a new law. North Koreans now can't even leave their home province without a special permit. The government has to control every move. The Russian government isn't talking about anything like that yet, but it might not need to. The Russian economy is doing that on its own. The Kremlin's put a lot of new rubles into the economy over the last 4 years, and that means only one thing. Inflation has skyrocketed. 13.75% in 2022, 5.86% in 2023, 8.44% in 2024, and about 9.27% in 2025. High inflation means only one thing. Russia's central bank has had to step in and raise interest rates to 21%. The inflation means that Russians can barely afford bread, eggs, or sugar now. How are they supposed to pay for transportation or hotels? Welcome to the North Korean experience. So the economy and subsistence are doing a lot to keep the Russian people in place. They're all exactly where they need to be. Less movement means it's easier for the government to track them and put them on the draft boards. But Putin learned from his other BFF just in case. The new draft laws have come with some high-tech insurance policies to make sure they're enforced. Before the war, there was a 20-day grace period for conscripts to report for duty. Not anymore. As of November 2025, you're trapped instantly. And Putin wanted to make sure people couldn't have an "I didn't know the order was in the mail" excuse. The 2023 law meant draft notices are now posted electronically and marked on the official register of legal documents as soon as they get put up. In other words, effective immediately. Individuals that have officially been called up must surrender their passports within 5 days' notice. They will only be returned when that individual's tour of service ends. So, if you're a man in Russia between the ages of 18 and 30, you're expected to keep checking your inbox. The moment the notice is in there, that's it. It's over. whether you see it or not. And once you're tagged by the system, you're not just trapped, you're hunted if you don't show up to your station. And the system gets stronger all the time. Just this November, Putin signed yet another law. There is now a 30-day expiration date for electronic draft notices. That sounds like a good thing, but it's not. Military draft boards used to be able to keep troops called up on standby indefinitely. Now they have 30 days to actually deploy those troops. Russia still does its call-ups on a biannual basis, but now draftees will be sent to their service points at 2 periods, between April 1st and July 15th, then another round from October 1st to December 31st. The new law is a step closer to a year-round draft in Russia. Lag times and bottlenecks will be reduced now. Russian troops will get sent to the front faster. Why so frantic? Because for Putin and his government, there's no choice. Russia is well past 1 million casualties now. Security experts predict that its military capability will degrade considerably through 2026. War spending has cannibalized the rest of the economy. It can't be sustained for too much longer. It's now or never. That means more troops have to get sent to the front. Putin has to grab as much territory as possible so he can sell a victory in Ukraine to a Russian public that has sacrificed a lot. So what happens to those who try to run? You're about to see just how far Russia will go to crush escape. Xi Jinping has spent more time with Putin than any other foreign leader. It's not just for business. The two are said to have a close personal relationship, too. So that means Xi is happy to let Putin in on more of his methods and sell him surveillance equipment. It starts with tracking and facial recognition software. The system was first tested in select regions like Sakhalin, Mari El, and Ryazan in 2024. It proved to be so effective that the government started to roll it out nationwide this year. So, what does it do? The Gosuslugi government portal is the device that sends people their electronic draft card, but it has a double life. As soon as the notices get sent out, they're entered into all the surveillance databases at the border checkpoints. Their personal information, their physical attributes, their identities, probably even their moods. The border guards know everything. If a drafted Russian man tries to get past a checkpoint, there will be an FSA agent waiting for him. Once in custody, he'll be warned that his failure to report for service will lead to criminal charges. Russia's been using the system to target 135,000 men in the fall of 2025, and it's getting the job done. But Russia still isn't North Korea. Escape is possible. But escaping from Russia when you're drafted is still a bit like trying to escape from North Korea. The geopolitics doesn't favor it. Russian borders with other NATO countries are short and under heavy surveillance. Besides, most of the Russian draftees aren't anywhere near there. The people dying in Ukraine aren't from Moscow or St. Petersburg. They're not from the most densely packed parts of European Russia. That would come with some unpleasant political consequences. They come from Russia's poorer minority and geographically isolated communities. Siberia, the Caucasus Mountains, places where there are less ethnic Russians. The numbers tell the story. Around 77% of Russia's population lives in the European heartland. You'd think that naturally a similar proportion of the mobilized troops would come from there, right? Russia isn't honest about its casualty figures, but investigative journalists did some deep diving at the end of 2023. That was an important time period because it was the first full year that Putin used the mobilized conscripts in large numbers. They found something astonishing. In the east, far past the Ural Mountains, you'll find the Russian Republic of Buryatia, population almost 980,000 in the 2021 census. By comparison, Moscow had around 13 million, but by December 2023, 18% of the war's total casualties came from just this place. Dagestan and Chechnya are also favorites for the Russian war machine. If the men there can't get to the top of the UFC, they're almost certain to be sent to the front. The numbers proved it. 15% of the casualties came from Dagestan, and another 12% from Chechnya. It's actually easy for outside journalists to find. As early as the spring of 2022, a lot of the confirmed casualties had names suggesting that they came from Russia's North Caucasus Federal District. If you're an ethnic minority in Russia and you live outside the European heartland, your chances of dying in Ukraine weren't just a few times higher than your countrymen in the West or North. They were 75 times higher. It got to the point that the former president of Mongolia, Sakajian Elbadors, said that Russia's minorities were being treated like cannon fodder, and he invited many of them to come across the border where they would be treated much better. So, if you're a Russian man that wants to take up that invitation, you have to look at other escape routes. The border with Kazakhstan alone is 7,644 kilometers, the longest continuous land border in the world. It borders 14 other countries by land, and 15 if you include the maritime border with the United States. The guards can't be watching everywhere, but getting across all the security, across such vast stretches of land, when you're living in poverty? Tough. The people that managed to get out of the country early had resources, and the surveillance network has become much more sophisticated since then. There's also another obstacle. Russia doesn't punish the families of people who escape like North Korea. At least, not yet. But the men who would like to go on the run often have to make that tough choice anyway. Getting out is hard enough. Getting out alongside wives and children is even harder. So the choice is either to leave them behind or get sent right to the front. Yet the human drive for freedom from autocracy seems to be impossible to hold down. If it can exist in North Korea, it can definitely exist in Russia. That's why there's something like a Russian underground railroad now, dedicated to getting people out. It's understandably not based in Russia, though. It's a Georgian NGO called Idat Lesam, which translates to Go by the Forest in English. The meaning isn't literal, though. It's a play on words back from Soviet times. The real meaning? Get lost. By the spring of 2023, it helped 6,800 Russian men break out of the prison their boss was building. The founder himself is an exiled Russian, Grigory Sverdlin. He got on Putin's bad side years ago by being an anti-homelessness activist. Hard to believe, but true. The organization helps them get all over the world, not just to border countries like Kazakhstan or popular travel spots like Turkey, but to as far afield as Argentina. Go by the Forest doesn't say how it gets people out, but it does have some advice. Change residences frequently to stay ahead of the authorities, and communicate through Telegram, which offers end-to-end encryption. Instagram was popular once, but it's now closed off. The mountains or endless steppe might be a daunting journey, but for people who are looking to escape, they're all much better prospects than a trip through the military. It's not just about the dangers of the front. Reporting for duty alone is frightening. Recruits sometimes don't even have proper beds. Footage has shown them sleeping on the floor, so you can imagine what equipping them must be like. Imagine showing up as you're ordered, and then you find that the body armor you're supposed to get isn't a real set. Sometimes it just looks like the real thing. Sometimes it's actually just a toy designed for an airsoft paintball game. That was the experience of a lot of the mobilized troops. Where'd the real armor go? Into the pockets of corrupt logistics officers who wanted to make a quick buck on the black market. If they can't steal the whole thing, sometimes they just take the ceramic or steel plates that can make them their coin. Some of the mobilized troops knew better than to trust their superiors, so they showed up with body armor that their families bought for them on the private market. Technically, it's illegal for Russian troops to have to buy their own armor. The state is supposed to provide, but the joke's on the draftees. That armor their family spent a lot on tends to get stolen, either by more corrupt officers or from more seasoned veterans who can't resist a little hazing. The stolen equipment then gets sold on platforms like Avito, or put onto other troops that the bosses want to preferentially survive. And if that's not shocking enough, just wait. Some of the mobilized troops don't even get the basic weapons they're supposed to. Some of the draftees get the AKM rifle, first introduced in 1959. They were just broken out of storage. Reliability after all that time is one concern, but it was also a logistical nightmare. Regular Russian combat units use the AK-74M or AK-12 rifles, chambered for the 5.45mm rounds, but the AKM uses 7.62mm rounds. You know what that means. A lot of troops went to battle without ammunition. British intelligence said the conscripts were using barely functioning rifles. But don't try complaining about it. For one thing, no one will hear you. Russia looks a lot more like China these days, not in its wealth, but in its censorship. Russia started to close the internet off when the troops moved across the border. Facebook, censored. Twitter or X, banned. Google, closed down and fined for 20 decillion, 181 quintillion times bigger than the entire global economy. iPhones, keep them precious. They're not replaceable now. YouTube still works, but the Kremlin cut the bandwidth in 2024. That means if you're trying to watch this video in Russia without a VPN, it'll feel like those old dial-up modems from the 90s, maybe worse. The nightly news channels, run by the state or by favored companies like Gazprom. So Russians tend to hear only one thing: real men serve in the military. They're told they should be proud, and stories of the meat grinder don't spread like they should. The internet's supposed to be closed until the end of the war, but don't bet on that. If you think this ends with the war, think again. For many Russians, the front line is just the beginning. What's one thing even Democratic leaders don't like to do? Give up power once they've gotten it. For Putin, the war has been an excuse to concentrate power even he never had before that. Russia now has the technology to ID anyone at any time, to own their bodies for whatever reason Putin wants. The draft isn't about obedience or patriotism, it's about control. If things get bad enough, there's now the infrastructure to prevent anyone from leaving. Just like North Korea. And just like North Korea, the borders were supposedly sealed to protect the nation. What they actually did was wall it off and destroyed it. Just no concentration camps for people trying to leave. Yet.
Power plants exploding, railways collapsing, tanks breaking down in the mud. Russia's army is begging North Korea for help, and its economy is being kept alive by war spending and delusion. This isn't a Cold War superpower. It's a zombie state lurching toward collapse in real time. Putin promised to restore Russian greatness. Instead, he's turned the country into an international punchline. Half the soldiers are dead or fleeing. Entire cities are freezing through winter without heat. North Korean workers are laying Russian train tracks. And the Kremlin's solution? More war. More lies, more rot. But this collapse doesn't stop at Russia's borders, because when a nuclear-armed empire falls apart, the whole world trembles. Welcome to the final act of the Putin era, and the slow-motion collapse of a country that once terrified the world, but can't even keep the lights on. Russia's economy looks like it should be okay. Actually, it looks a lot healthier than even some of the world's biggest economies. It grew at a rate of 4.3% in 2024. That was more than the United Kingdom or even the United States. Actually, a 4.3% growth rate is something American politicians might look on with envy. Why? Because the average rate of growth in the U.S. economy between 2000 and 2023 was 2.3%. Those aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. The difference between 2% growth and 4% growth has a huge impact on the living standards people can expect to enjoy. Russia's growth is partially thanks to trade with China hitting record levels and surging oil exports to other countries like India. For Putin, it's allowed the Russian economy to keep going and weather the storm of Western sanctions. Or so he hoped. Here's a question that might as well be a needle. Russians aren't exactly living large, are they? They're not the ones enjoying higher living standards. That's because Russia's recent GDP growth isn't based on anything organic. The US government could spend a lot of money and its GDP would grow too. And that's the secret. Putin's special military operation has sent growth upward, but it's a balloon or even a soap bubble being blown up entirely by the government spending a lot of money on the war. Without that, get ready for a downturn. And it's not going to be a soft landing. Putin likes to smirk and say that the West's sanctions haven't worked. Well, they have. They cost Russia's economy between 2 and 3% of its GDP every year. Sure, Russia had healthy growth in 2023 and 2024, but in dollar terms, its GDP actually shrank. In 2013, the Russian economy was worth $2.3 trillion. 11 years later, it was $1.9 trillion. Why start the tracker at 2013? Because that was the last year the West was still naive enough to think that Russia was a normal country. Then Putin sent his little green men into Crimea and the sanctions started. So now, even though it's growing, Russia's economy gets the worst of both worlds. The first punch in the combo is 8.1% inflation, or at least that's what the official sources say. You know what that's worth when it comes to Russia. Independent sources think the country's inflation rate goes as high as 9 or 10%. That means the Russian people are in the spiral of a cost of living crisis. If you're in the United States, you probably complained about the bad inflation in 2022 and 2023, but you could still afford eggs. A lot of Russians can't these days. Bananas? Sugar? They're also too expensive. But that's just the jab in the combination. Now comes the power punch. The Central Bank of Russia has done exactly what the U.S. Federal Reserve did to get ahead of inflation. It's raised interest rates. Much, much higher than the Fed. Try 21%. That's done what it's supposed to do. It's stopped inflation from getting any higher, but it's only a Pyrrhic victory. The high interest rates also mean it's pretty much impossible for ordinary Russians to get credit. And guess what that means? Businesses can't start or expand. People don't get hired. So the only business that can hire on a big scale is the government, and then Russia's people become cogs in the war machine. If they're lucky, they'll be sent to the factories. If not, they'll get a ticket punch for the front. So Russia's economy is in a state of war-driven stagflation. Think the 1970s misery in the United States, just with a lot of people dying. But even this can't last forever. Putin built up a lot of foreign cash reserves before the war, and they've allowed him to keep going for far longer than he intended. But snows always melt. Before the war, Russia had $183 billion in its national wealth fund. Last year, it was just $55 billion. And those sanctions Russia thought it evaded, they put about half of the foreign reserves on ice. No one really has the stomach to buy Russian bonds either. So now, Russia has a budget deficit of about $40 billion a year. That sounds like a walk through a peaceful meadow compared to the gargantuan U.S. budget deficit every year. It's just that Russia doesn't have the world's reserve currency. So don't expect that 4.3% growth rate in 2024 to repeat in 2025. Early in the year, Russia's finance ministry predicted 2.5% growth. Then it had to slash that down. In August, the prediction moved a full point down to 1.5%. Why? You know the answer. High interest rates and the exhaustive war economy. But it gets worse. China and India have begun to buy less Russian energy of late because they're afraid of getting slapped with secondary sanctions. That means Russia's options are declining even further. It will need to rely on war spending to limp along. What happens when the cane falls away? Look at Nizhny Novgorod in January 2024. This is the Russian winter, so the last thing anyone would want to do is lose heat here. But that's what happened as a pipe burst. And that wasn't the only one. Even Vladivostok, Russia's crown jewel in the east, had a pipe burst around the same time. And that's just the beginning. Before we dive deeper, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep going and expose the truth that Vladimir Putin doesn't like to see reported. Consider it a way of annoying him. Anyway, Russia is full of aging Soviet-era infrastructure. Between 60 and 70% of the country's heating infrastructure has actually exceeded its service life. But what can a government do if it's forced to spend all its money on war? Pray for the best. But God doesn't seem to be in an answering mood. Just in the winter between 2023 and 2024, when Russia's finances were in better shape, there were 577 major incidents of infrastructure failure. Not even Moscow has escaped. 150,000 people lost power in the suburbs when a heating pipe failed. It's not just the heating systems either. Russia's transit infrastructure has also come under strain, and that's not exactly great for home defense. Last August, Ukraine was in the mood for a special military operation of its own. It took the war into Russian territory by invading Kursk Oblast. Russia was caught by surprise, because how dare Ukraine invade back, right? Still, Putin couldn't risk such an embarrassment to his regime, so he had to rush reinforcements to the border again. It didn't go smoothly. Remember that convoy that was stalled outside of Kiev for days and piled up for miles at the start of the war? Putin probably, privately, had an unwelcome feeling of déjà vu as the latest news rolled into the Kremlin. Russia relies heavily on its rail network for both military and commercial transportation, but it's hardly a first-class operation. This is no Japanese Shinkansen network. Trains were crammed into Kursk's stations. The movements were so badly executed that freight into Belarus had to be stopped due to congestion. And the similarities with Kiev don't stop there. A lot of trains were simply abandoned on the sidings because there wasn't enough labor to move them back. Why? How's this for cannibalization? A lot of Russia's train workers were either drafted into the military or reassigned to factories to produce war goods. So the railway network was short of 3,000 train drivers and assistants. It's gotten so bad that Russia has been forced to resort to offering signing bonuses in hopes of attracting new workers. The thing is, they won't even be able to properly repair their rail networks because the Western sanctions Putin dismissed mean that they can't get many critical spare parts. So naturally, Russia's railway freight has fallen to a 15-year low, and yes, that includes the pandemic. But the tragicomedy only gets deeper from here. What's a country without its people? Russia has had a falling fertility rate since the 1950s. It bottomed out at 1.16 in 1999. There's a surprise when you look at the chart, though. In 2022 and 2023, the fertility rate was about 1.4. Then in 2024 and so far in 2025, it spiked to 1.83. That's probably news Putin will welcome, but it's not going to save Russia from the cold long-term math. Sub-replacement fertility is just the first hit to Russia's demographic prospects. The special military operation was only supposed to last for a few days, but then Ukraine did a lot better than Putin expected, and suddenly he needed to call reservists to the colors in the first of a wave of mobilizations. Oh sure, Putin made sure to avoid calling in reservists from Moscow and St. Petersburg, but it didn't stop a lot of the people there from leaving anyway. Up to 1.5 million people left, and they're not just any people. They're a mix of business owners, tech workers, and other well-educated individuals. So Russia's economy became even more dependent on the energy industry. The reservists unlucky enough to stay in Russia were sent to the front, and it's making the demographic problems even worse. This summer, Russian casualties passed 1 million. In June, the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated the number of dead at 250,000. If you're a statesman in Russia, how do you plan on replacing that amount with such a low fertility rate? Immigration? Not likely. 80% of Russians think there are too many immigrants in the country. Russia might not be a democracy, but it has responded to the public pressure by cutting its quota for foreign residency permits. That was 10,600 in 2023, but only 5,500 in 2025. Not that Russia is a popular destination for immigrants anyway. After all, Putin has pretty much resorted to forced recruitment and coercive conscription. Putin has lured foreign workers into Russia and then sent them to the front under threat of deportation or much worse, enjoying the hospitality of a Russian jail. But even that's still not enough, so Russia had to make a deal with North Korea to get the necessary manpower. About 12,000 troops have come to Russia, helping to fight off the Ukrainians in Kursk. There's even an exhibition of North Korean war paintings that opened in Moscow in September of 2025. So now Russia gets the dubious distinction of being a partner in North Korea's propaganda, not because it was the first choice, but because there was no other choice. But have you ever thought about something? Why exactly has Russia taken 1 million casualties against an enemy that it outnumbers and outshoots? Here's just one paradox. Russia always used to consider itself a tank power. It had more tanks than any other country before the war, by far. There were at least 10,200 tanks. 3,300 of them were operational. Then there were the ones in storage. In total, the Soviet Union and its successor state produced 17,300 tanks between the 1950s and the invasion of Ukraine. It was the stuff of NATO's worst nightmares. Think of a mechanized version of a zombie apocalypse. That's why the West designed its own tanks like the Abrams, Challenger, and Leopard. These tanks are meant to be highly survivable because quality had to matter. Russia's tank fleet is even one reason why aircraft like the F-22 Raptor are around. It was designed to make sure NATO didn't lose superiority in the skies. That was the only way to ensure that the alliance could fight against endless waves of Russian tanks. You know, without resorting to nuclear weapons. But Ukraine has shown something in 3 years. Zombie apocalypses are only movies, at least for now. The real apocalypse is with Russia's tanks. As of October 1st, 2025, the Oryx blog reports that Russia has lost 4,152 of them. 3,071 of these have been damaged, 73.9% of the total. That's because they're temperamental. They can't take much damage or their unprotected ammunition magazines will explode and blow the tops off the things. That's why you have stories of Russian tanks going airborne. Get it? With the premier tanks in the fleet up in the sky in flames, Russia has had to break out tanks from the 1950s and 60s out of storage. And it turns out that making tanks fly isn't the only one of the tricks in this bad magic show. There's some accounting fraud in it too. When then Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that Russian factories delivered 1,530 tanks to its forces in December 2023, he didn't mention that 85% of them weren't newly manufactured units. They were just refurbished Cold War-era junk. The other 15% of them were newer stuff like the T-90M, but even that 15% wasn't what you would call legit. Some of them were just upgraded older hulls, and the T-90M is still just a derivative of the old Soviet stuff, which is why it can get airborne too. The T-14 Armata was and still is a no-show, and that story is a disaster that might as well have its own video. Russia's war economy is covering some of the shortfall, but it's still losing tanks at an astounding rate. By late 2024, the cracks in the foundation were showing. The Economist reported that Russia was starting to see shortages of its Soviet-era tanks. It was also resorting to taking the barrels off of old towed artillery and putting them on self-propelled howitzers. Early in 2024, Britain's Royal United Services Institute reported that it expected the Russian military to perform at a high level that year and throughout 2025, but that the losses would pile up and seriously degrade its performance in 2026. That prediction looks like it's coming right on schedule. So at last we've arrived at the most tragically funny irony. Russia might have cannibalized its economy for the war, but the performance of its military has been so subpar that it won't matter much in the end. But for Putin, there's no way out. It's his war. He has to make it work or find himself taking an early vacation to a Siberian dacha at best. This fact isn't a laughing matter for Russian people, but it means that Kremlin watching can be an interesting business. Putin's tried a cabinet reshuffle, replacing Sergei Shoigu with Andrei Belousov as Minister of Defense in 2024, but that's not enough. The war pressures are tearing at Putin from all sides. His close allies are criticizing him for not fighting the war hard enough, that is. Igor Girkin, who was in the FSB with him, got arrested for saying that. That was easy enough. It's not so easy to arrest entire units of armed men. That could be the biggest trouble of all. Russia is a vast country with hundreds of different languages and ethnic groups. In fact, it's still an imperial system. These people are held together more by the strength of central government in Moscow than any natural ties. Without that, you might be amazed at how quickly some of them can go at each other's throats. Dagestani and Chechen units have gotten into it among each other, and Russia's ethnic minorities have taken a disproportionate share of the war's casualties so that ethnic Russians don't need to. That puts pressure on the entire system, and there's even been some foreign support for that pressure. Mongolia's former president, Sarkisian Elbigdorf, said that Russia was using its minority population as cannon fodder and urged its Buryat, Tuva, and Kalmyk population in particular to flee to Mongolia as refugees, where they would be welcomed with open arms and hearts as well. Moscow's remaining partners in the region are also getting alarmed. Even the former Soviet states in Asia don't want to rely on Russia for protection anymore. Armenia wasn't happy with Russia when its ally didn't do much to help it during its wars with Azerbaijan earlier this decade. And Tajikistan is trying to increase its own military capability to be less reliant on Russia for its security. So where will all this end? Just look at the loss side of the ledger. Russia has become the most sanctioned country in the world. NATO's been strengthened with the addition of Finland and Sweden. Ukraine has become well armed, and the portion outside of Russia's control is now broken away from its orbit forever, even if it doesn't wind up joining the alliance. Russia's depleted decades worth of equipment that it won't be able to replace. More importantly, it's lost precious lives that it won't get back thanks to the low fertility rate and the out-migration of some of its most productive people. And it's shaken the confidence of its minority population in the entire Russian project. Even its close allies in the region don't look at it the same way. And on the gain side of the ledger, perhaps about 20% of Ukraine, which won't do much to strengthen Russia's geographical position against NATO. Oh, and it's gotten some stronger ties with North Korea. Is that a trade you would make? Let us know in the comments since it helps the channel. Putin invaded Ukraine because he wanted to make Russia great again. Call it MRGA, maybe. Instead, he made Russia a meme. It's sort of like a live stream you can check into if you want to see in real time what a collapsing great power looks like. It's a disaster, and you can't look away. For years, Russia told the world it was back, that it was untouchable, that the West was in decline, and Moscow was rising. Now, its economy is bleeding, its soldiers are dying, and its empire is dying the same slow death as every fallen power before it. Because history has a script, and Russia is reading it line by line. Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union, all fell in 7 stages. Russia has reached stage 6, the final stop before collapse. War, debt, demographic decay, global isolation. Every warning light is flashing red. And yet, the Kremlin still insists everything is under control, just like the Soviets did, right before they vanished. So today, we're walking you through the collapse stage by stage as it happens in real time. Not theory, not prediction, but the unraveling of a superpower that still thinks it's winning. This is the terminal phase of Russia's illusion. And the fall is already underway. Think about this for a moment. Right now, as you watch this video, Russia is throwing everything it has at survival. Over 100,000 Russian soldiers have died this year alone. The budget deficit is exploding. Spending surged 29% in early 2025 compared to last year. Interest rates hit 21%, the highest in 25 years. And yet, nothing is working. The bleeding won't stop. This is what historians call a terminal spiral, when an empire's attempts to save itself only accelerate its destruction. And here's what makes this terrifying. Putin knows. He has to know, because every dying empire reaches this exact moment when denial becomes the only strategy left. The meetings in the Kremlin must be surreal now. Generals explaining why another 1,000 men died for nothing. Economic ministers pretending inflation is manageable while prices double. Demographic experts showing charts that look like cliff edges. And Putin sitting at his absurdly long table, pretending he doesn't see the empire dying in real time. Every dictator reaches this moment. Stalin died denying the doctor's plot he invented. Hitler spent his last days moving imaginary armies on a map. And now Putin, architect of Russia's destruction, conducting an orchestra that's already fled the building. But before we show you how this ends, we need to rewind. Because Russia didn't arrive at stage 6 overnight. It followed a pattern so predictable, so mathematically precise, that we can track it step by step. Every single empire dies the same way. Rome took 4 centuries to collapse. The British Empire took about 70 years. The Soviet Union, just 7. And they all followed the exact same playbook. 7 stages, 7 steps from glory to rubble, overextension, currency debasement, debt spiral, productive collapse, social decay, international irrelevance, and finally, the fall itself. The Spanish Empire was the first global superpower. At its peak, it controlled territory on every inhabited continent. Its currency was the world's reserve. Its military was considered invincible. Sound familiar? By 1640, Spain had checked every box. Endless wars in Europe drained the treasury. They debased their currency by mixing copper into silver coins. They defaulted on loans 4 times. Their productive economy collapsed as they relied entirely on gold from the Americas. Birth rates plummeted, and when the gold ran out, the empire that ruled the world for 2 centuries was suddenly nothing. Britain's collapse was more graceful but followed the same pattern. 2 world wars broke them financially. The pound lost its reserve status. Colonies broke away. By 1956, when the Suez Crisis exposed their weakness, the empire that once ruled a quarter of the planet couldn't even control a canal. But the most relevant example? The Soviet Union. Because what's happening to Russia now is almost a carbon copy of what happened to the USSR in the 1980s. The patterns are so exact, it's almost mathematical. Economic overheating followed by sudden cooling. Military victories that become Pyrrhic defeats. Allies who suddenly discover other priorities. Even the rhetoric is identical. The desperate appeals to patriotism, the blame on foreign enemies, the promises that victory is just months away. If you showed these patterns to any historian without telling them the country, they'd say the same thing. This empire has maybe 5 years left, probably less. And just like today's Russia, the Soviets insisted everything was fine, right until the moment it wasn't. Let's start with stage 1, because Russia's collapse began the moment Putin convinced himself he could rebuild the Soviet empire. February 24th, 2022, the day Russia signed its own death warrant. Putin promised a 3-day special military operation. He got a 3-year meat grinder instead. Russia has now suffered over 1 million casualties, killed and wounded in Ukraine. Think about that number. 1 million sons, fathers, husbands gone or broken forever. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Military spending now consumes roughly 7 to 8% of Russia's GDP, double what America spends, triple what most NATO countries spend. In 2025, Russia plans to allocate 40% of its entire federal budget to defense and security spending. Imagine that, nearly half of every tax ruble going to fund a war that was supposed to last 3 days. And here's what's truly insane. They're losing. In all of 2024, Russian forces seized just 4,168 square kilometers, less than 1% of Ukraine. They're paying in blood for every meter, and they're running out of both. According to Medusa, the true death toll is estimated between 200,000 and 220,000 Russians killed. Not wounded, not missing, dead, gone forever. More than America lost in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined in just 3 years. These aren't just statistics. These are entire generations being erased. Entire villages in Siberia and the Caucasus have lost their prime-age males to the front. Wives without husbands, children without fathers, communities without futures. And for what? A few abandoned Ukrainian villages and fields? Territory that's been so thoroughly destroyed it's worthless? This is what overextension looks like in real time. An empire bleeding itself dry for gains so small they're barely visible on a map. But the real cost isn't measured in kilometers. It's measured in what comes next. Because when empires overextend militarily, they always turn to the same solution. They debase their currency. They print money. They destroy the very foundation of their economy. Which brings us to stage 2 and the ruble's death spiral. Remember when one US dollar bought 75 rubles? That was early 2022. Today, over 110 rubles. That's a collapse of about 47%, but that's not even the real problem. The real problem is that Russians have stopped believing in their own currency. The money supply has doubled since 2021, from 62 trillion rubles to 118 trillion in February 2025. They're literally printing money to pay for the war, and everyone knows what that means. Inflation is officially at 9%. Walk into any Moscow grocery store and you'll see the real number. Butter prices doubled, meat prices through the roof. Core inflation hit 9.7% annualized in October 2024, and that's with the government desperately trying to hide the real numbers. The central bank solution? Raise interest rates to 21%, the highest since the 1990s collapse. But here's the dirty secret. It's not working, because you can't fight wartime inflation with monetary policy, not when the government is the one flooding the economy with printed money. By 2023, the Chinese yuan had replaced the US dollar as the most traded currency on the Moscow exchange. Think about that. Russians trust China's currency more than their own. They're literally abandoning the ruble for foreign money, the ultimate vote of no confidence. And why wouldn't they? The ruble is toilet paper dressed up as money. Everyone knows it. The government knows it. They just can't admit it. Because admitting it would mean acknowledging what comes next, the death spiral that no empire survives, which is exactly what's happening right now. Stage 3 is when the bills come due, and Russia's bills are astronomical. Russia recorded a budget deficit of 3.49 trillion rubles in 2024. That's after revenues jumped 26%. They're making more money than ever, spending even more, and still can't balance the books. But here's where it gets truly desperate. The government spent more on debt repayment and interest than it raised from new borrowing. They're literally going backward, paying more to service old debt than they can borrow in new money. The liquid portion of the National Wealth Fund, Russia's rainy day money, stands at just $31 billion. That's it. That's all they have left after burning through hundreds of billions. At the current burn rate, they'll be completely broke within 2 years. And they can't borrow internationally. Cut off from global markets, trapped with 21% interest rates at home, they're stuck in a vice that's only tightening. The budget deficit for 2024 exceeded projections by more than double. They planned for 1.6 trillion rubles. They got 3.3 trillion. And 2025, the deficit is projected to remain above 1.5% of GDP indefinitely. Indefinitely. That's government speak for we have no idea how to fix this. The math is simple and terrifying. War spending up, tax revenues flat, borrowing costs exploding, reserves nearly gone. You know what comes next, don't you? When governments can't borrow and can't tax, they have one option left, one that the Soviets tried, one that Weimar Germany tried, one that Venezuela tried. They print until the money becomes worthless and the economy becomes a corpse. Which leads us directly to stage 4, the death of Russia's actual economy. Here's what's really happening inside Russia. The economy is being hollowed out like a carved pumpkin. Industrial output growth fell to near zero in February 2025. Investment is collapsing. A 0.5% decline in investment is expected in 2026. The private sector has essentially stopped spending on anything except survival. But the real catastrophe? The exodus. About 650,000 Russians emigrated in 2022-2023 following the invasion, primarily young professionals in tech, science, and business. The very people Russia needed to build a modern economy. They're gone, and they're not coming back. Over 1,500 foreign companies have left Russia since 2022. Toyota, Volkswagen, Microsoft, Apple, the entire Western corporate world pulled out. And what replaced them? Chinese knockoffs and domestic substitutes that don't work. Russia can't even produce commercial airliners anymore. They're cannibalizing their existing fleet for parts. Weapons production is running at zero profit margins, sometimes negative. The vaunted military-industrial complex is basically a money incinerator. By the end of 2024, Russian companies were short 2.2 million workers. Almost 70% of businesses reported severe labor shortages. You can't run an economy when everyone's either dead, fled, or fighting. And here's the sickest irony. The only thing keeping Russia's economy moving is the war. Military production, soldier salaries, death payments to families. That's the economy now. They've created a war-driven GDP that looks like growth, but is actually decay. The Center for Macroeconomic Analysis admits private sector investment has virtually stopped growing. Companies aren't building factories. They're not developing technology. They're not training workers. They're just trying to survive until what? Until the war ends? Until sanctions lift? Until the economy magically recovers? It won't, because this isn't a recession you recover from. It's economic death by 1,000 cuts, and Russia is already bleeding from 999. What happens when the war ends? Or worse, what happens when they can't sustain it anymore? The productive economy is already gone. What's left is a zombie animated by military spending and nothing else. And zombies, as we all know, eventually stop walking. But economies can survive a lot. They can survive debt, inflation, even production collapse. What they can't survive is when the people themselves give up. Welcome to Stage 5, where societies don't just decline, they disintegrate. In 2024, Russia recorded just 1.222 million births, the lowest since 1999. The first quarter of 2025 saw fewer than 294,000 births, the lowest quarterly figure in 225 years. Let that sink in. The lowest in 225 years. Not since Napoleon invaded has Russia seen birth rates this catastrophic. The natural population decline in 2024 was 596,200 people. Deaths exceeded births by over 500,000. The total fertility rate is just 1.41 children per woman, far below the 2.1 needed for replacement. But it's not just about babies, it's about hope, or rather the complete absence of it. In some regions, deaths outnumber births by 3 to 1. Entire regions are becoming graveyards. Over 18% of Russians are now senior citizens, a record high. By 2050, nearly a quarter of the population will be elderly. Who's going to work? Who's going to fight? Who's going to pay the pensions? Nobody, because they were never born. And those who were born are leaving or dying. Hundreds of thousands more wounded, many disabled for life. The young are gone. The middle-aged are exhausted. The old are forgotten. This is demographic collapse in real time. Russia has started classifying demographic data, hiding the true scale of the catastrophe. When governments start hiding population statistics, you know the situation is beyond salvation. Putin even created a demographic special forces unit to boost birth rates. Special forces for making babies. If it wasn't so pathetic, it would be funny. But here's the thing about demographic collapse. It's irreversible. You can't suddenly create 20-year-olds. You can't resurrect the dead. You can't force women to have children in a country with no future. The population pyramid isn't a pyramid anymore. It's a coffin. Wide at the top, narrow at the bottom, and getting narrower every day. Societies can recover from war. They can recover from economic crisis. They can't recover when there's no one left to recover. Which brings us to stage 6, the stage Russia has reached, the point where the world simply stops caring whether you exist or not. This is where we are now. Today, November 2025, Russia has become irrelevant. Remember when Europe depended on Russian gas? Russia's share of EU pipeline gas imports plummeted from over 40% in 2021 to about 11% in 2024. Europe weaned itself off Russian energy in less than 3 years. Russian oil now trades at massive discounts, $56 to $57 per barrel versus global prices. The petrostate that once held Europe hostage with energy is now begging China and India to buy its oil at bargain basement prices. Even traditional allies are walking away. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan refuse to endorse the war. Armenia is publicly broken with Moscow. Nobody wants the ruble. Nobody trusts it. $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves remain frozen by sanctions. Their money is literally being held hostage and they can't do anything about it. But here's the real indicator of irrelevance. The G7 doesn't include them. The G20 barely tolerates them. International forums happen without them. They've become a Chinese gas station, a junior partner selling resources at discount prices to the only country still willing to deal with them. China's two-way trade with Russia hit a record $240 billion in 2023, but it's not a partnership, it's dependency. Russia wanted to be feared, then they wanted to be respected. Now they'd settle for being relevant. But they're not. They're a nuclear-armed relic with a dying population and a collapsing economy, desperately fighting a war they can't win with money they don't have. The world has moved on. Europe found new energy. NATO got stronger. Ukraine became a hero. And Russia? Russia became a memory of what happens when empires refuse to accept reality. This is stage 6, the irrelevance before extinction. The moment when everyone realizes you're already gone. You just haven't stopped moving yet. But stage 7? That's when the movement stops. Here's what keeps Putin awake at night. Not NATO, not sanctions, not even losing in Ukraine. It's the sound of history repeating itself. Because he knows what stage 7 looks like. He watched it happen in 1991. The Soviet Union didn't explode, it simply stopped existing. One day it was there, the next day it wasn't. And the signs are already here. Regional governors are hoarding resources, ignoring Moscow's demands. Ethnic Russians now make up only 70% of the population and falling. Republics like Chechnya and Tatarstan are watching, waiting, calculating when to make their move. The economic triggers are all in place. If oil prices drop significantly or sanctions tighten further, Russia faces an economic implosion it can't survive. No reserves to cushion the fall. No borrowing capacity, no printing press solution that doesn't lead to hyperinflation. What does collapse look like? It's not dramatic, it's pathetic. Government salaries stop being paid, pensions disappear, police stop showing up for work, regions stop sending taxes to Moscow. The military, what's left of it, starts choosing sides. Maybe it starts in the Far East, where Moscow's control has always been weakest. Maybe in the Caucasus, where ethnic tensions simmer. Maybe in Kaliningrad, cut off from the mainland and surrounded by NATO. Or maybe it starts in Moscow itself, a palace coup, a military mutiny, a another Wagner-style march that doesn't stop this time. Russian analysts themselves warn the country faces bankruptcy in the medium term. The economy is on a spinning top that will fall if it slows down. But here's the truly terrifying part. Russia has nuclear weapons, thousands of them. What happens to those weapons when the state that controls them ceases to exist? Who gets them? Who sells them? Who uses them? The Soviet collapse was messy but peaceful. This one might not be, because Putin, unlike Gorbachev, won't go quietly. He'll burn it all down rather than admit defeat. The man who started a war to prevent NATO expansion has caused the largest NATO expansion in history. The man who invaded Ukraine to rebuild the empire has accelerated its final collapse. History doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And right now, it's rhyming with 1991, 1917, 1610, every time Russia has torn itself apart. The only question isn't if Russia collapses, it's how violent the collapse will be, and whether the rest of the world survives it. Stage 6 isn't ahead of Russia, it's under its feet. The mistakes have already been made, the empire already hollowed, the illusion already shattered. Economic growth has fallen to 1% and dropping. Birth rates at 200-year lows, hundreds of thousands of soldiers lost, budget deficits exceeding anything sustainable. The Kremlin knows it. That's why they're hiding statistics, classifying demographic data, and pretending everything's under control. That's why Putin talks about nuclear weapons more than victory. That's why Russian state TV has stopped promising to take Kiev and started threatening nuclear apocalypse. They know what we know, what history has always known. Empires die in stages. Russia has reached the terminal stage. Now comes the denial. Then comes the fall. Russia isn't collapsing, it's already collapsed. The only thing left is the crash. When it comes, not if, but when, remember that you watched it happen. Stage by stage, mistake by mistake, lie by lie. The empire that claimed it was eternal proved it was exactly like all the others. Already gone, just too proud to admit it. So what do you think? Is Russia headed for peaceful dissolution like the Soviet Union, or something far worse? And more importantly, who's going to be there to pick up the pieces? Let us know in the comments, because history is being written right now, and we're all watching it happen in real time.
Russia is collapsing, and it's collapsing soon. These were the first words that AI gave me when I posed the question, how will Russia collapse? The answer that followed was as startling as it was detailed. Not a nuclear war, not an invasion by a foreign power, but a slow-motion implosion from within. A scenario more unexpected than any of us imagined. In this video, we'll unpack the AI's prediction step by step. We'll explore the hard data and geopolitical trends behind this bold claim. From Russia's dwindling population and war casualties to brewing regional fractures. By the end, you'll understand why some experts say Russia has become a human volcano about to explode, and how its collapse might actually unfold. Let's dive in. Most people think collapse looks like tanks rolling through the streets or a mushroom cloud on the horizon, but the AI painted a different picture entirely. Russia's unraveling won't arrive with a bang. It's already underway, bleeding out slowly through wounds that can never fully heal. Start with the battlefield. As of late 2025, the UK Ministry of Defense estimates that Russian casualties, killed and wounded, have well surpassed 1.5 million. Let that sink in for a moment. Over 1 million Russian citizens removed from families, from the workforce, from the future. Independent journalists at Medusa and Mediazona, working with BBC Russian, have painstakingly verified the names of over 153,000 individual soldiers killed in Ukraine. They've done this through obituaries, court records, and inheritance filings, documenting each death one by one. And that's just the losses they can confirm. The true death toll is almost certainly far higher, with Western intelligence agencies placing the figure somewhere between 190,000 and 350,000 dead. The bodies aren't coming from Moscow's wealthy districts or St. Petersburg's educated elite. The verified death counts reveal something far starker. Bashkortostan, Tatarstan, and the Sverdlovsk region have suffered the highest confirmed fatalities. Russia's poorest and most remote communities are shouldering this burden, while the capital carries on as if nothing is happening. Moscow, a city of almost 13 million people, has lost a fraction of what small ethnic republics have sacrificed. The pattern is unmistakable, and the resentment is building. Those who survived the front lines often return shattered beyond recognition. The AI warned of a mass return of psychologically traumatized soldiers, and we're already witnessing the consequences ripple through Russian society. Surges in alcoholism, spikes in domestic violence, rising crime rates in communities now flooded with men who've spent years trapped in a meat grinder. Tens of thousands have come home missing limbs, suffering from traumatic brain injuries, completely unable to work or function in civilian life. The Russian healthcare system, already strained before the war, cannot begin to handle the flood of broken men requiring lifelong care. For every coffin draped in the Russian flag, there are 3 or 4 wounded veterans who will never be the same. This isn't just a military problem anymore. It's a social time bomb ticking in thousands of Russian towns and villages. And the fuse is getting shorter. But here's what the AI emphasized most strongly. Losing soldiers is only the visible wound. What's happening to Russia's population is far more permanent and far more terrifying. Russia isn't just losing men on the battlefield, it's running out of Russians entirely. In February 2025, demographers confirmed something that hasn't happened in over 2 centuries. Russia recorded its lowest monthly birth count since the early 1800s. Just 90,500 babies were born that month, 7,400 fewer than in February the year before. Think about that, the lowest in 200 years. The Kremlin has tried everything to reverse this trend. Tax breaks for large families, restrictions on abortion, propaganda glorifying motherhood and traditional values. None of it is working. The decline only accelerates. In 2024, Russia recorded just 1.222 million births, the lowest annual total since 1999, when the country was still reeling from the chaos of Soviet collapse. Compared to a decade ago, the annual number of births has dropped by 1/3, and by the end of 2024, Russia's natural population decline, the gap between deaths and births, reached 596,200 people. That's a 20% increase over the previous year. In some regions, the picture is even grimmer. In Vladimir and Volgograd, 3 times as many people died as were born. The nation is literally shrinking before our eyes. Some regions are collapsing faster than others. In Smolensk, births fell by 26.6% in early 2025. Kostroma dropped 21.6%. Karelia, Arkhangelsk, and Oryol all saw declines approaching 20%. These aren't marginal shifts, they're demographic freefalls. Meanwhile, the only regions showing birth rate growth are the Muslim republics of the North Caucasus, Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia. The very regions Moscow has used as cannon fodder are the only ones still producing children. The ethnic composition of Russia is shifting beneath the Kremlin's feet, and there's nothing Putin's propaganda machine can do to reverse it. Russia's fertility rate has crashed to 1.4 children per woman. To maintain a stable population, you need at least 2.1. Even Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov admitted the situation is catastrophic for the future of the nation. And according to UN projections, if current trends continue, Russia's population could plummet from 146 million today to somewhere between 74 and 112 million by the end of this century. That's not a gradual decline, that's demographic annihilation playing out across generations. The war has poured gasoline on a fire that was already burning. Hundreds of thousands of young men are dead or disabled. Hundreds of thousands more have fled the country to avoid conscription. And the women left behind? Many are choosing not to have children at all, unwilling to bring new life into a nation spiraling toward an uncertain future. Russia wanted to expand its territory. Instead, it's watching its population vanish. So Russia is bleeding soldiers and watching its birth rate crater. But here's where the AI's prediction gets even darker. They're also hemorrhaging the workers needed to keep the country functioning. By the end of 2024, Russian companies were short 2.6 million employees, a record high. The labor shortage has become so severe that unemployment has fallen to a historic low of 2.2% in May 2025. On paper, that sounds like good news. In reality, it's a symptom of economic disaster. There simply aren't enough people to fill the jobs that keep a modern nation functioning. Manufacturing is short 391,000 workers. Trade is missing 347,000. Transportation can't find 219,000 drivers and logistics staff. Employers have grown so desperate they've started offering salaries of 100,000 rubles a month, 1.5 times the national average, just to attract basic labor. Wages rose 20% in 2024 alone, the fastest increase on record. But inflation is devouring those gains, and businesses are being crushed from both sides. The defense industry tells the same story. Since 2023, Russian military factories have added 520,000 workers. Yet they're still 160,000 short of what they need to meet production targets. The Kremlin is literally robbing the civilian economy to feed the war machine, poaching workers from construction, agriculture, and services to build tanks and missiles instead. It's an economic death spiral with no obvious exit. And then there's the brain drain. Since February 2022, somewhere between 650,000 and 900,000 Russians have fled the country. These aren't random citizens looking for adventure abroad. They're IT specialists, engineers, entrepreneurs, journalists, academics, the people who build modern economies. In the first 3 months after the invasion alone, an estimated 70,000 tech professionals left Russia. Roughly 10% of the country's entire IT workforce gone almost overnight. These weren't people who could easily be replaced. They were the architects of Russia's digital economy, the minds behind its startups, the voices of its independent media. Many landed in Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Turkey, anywhere that would take them without a visa. They set up remote work arrangements, launched businesses in exile, and built new lives far from the Kremlin's reach. Research from the Outrush Project found that only 8% of immigrants have returned between 2023 and 2024. And of those who came back in the months after the invasion, 80% left again by the summer of 2023. The Kremlin tried to dismiss them as traitors and Western puppets. But you can't build a modern economy with loyalty alone. You need talent, and Russia's talent walked out the door. A nation that can't replace its dead, can't attract workers, and can't retain its brightest minds is a nation living on borrowed time. But the AI pointed to something even more dangerous, something most people don't realize about Russia's so-called economic resilience. Western observers have marveled at Russia's apparent economic strength. GDP grew over 4% in 2024. The Kremlin boasts that sanctions have failed. But peel back the numbers and you find something very different. An economy running on fumes, propped up by unsustainable war spending and rapidly depleting reserves. In 2024, Russia ran a budget deficit of 3.49 trillion rubles, roughly $34 billion. That's the third consecutive year with deficits exceeding 3 trillion. And here's the number that should terrify Moscow. If you strip out oil and gas revenue, Russia's deficit equals 7.3% of GDP. The state is completely dependent upon hydrocarbons to function. And those revenues are collapsing, projected down 22% in 2025 as sanctions force Russian crude to sell at steep discounts. The average price for Urals oil has dropped to around $57 per barrel against budget assumptions of nearly $70. The National Wealth Fund, Russia's emergency savings account, is being drained month after month to cover the shortfall. Meanwhile, military spending has exploded to levels not seen since the Soviet era. The 2025 budget allocates roughly $140 billion to defense, a 25% increase from the previous year. Defense and security combined now consume over 43% of federal spending. For the first time under Putin's rule, military expenditure has surpassed social welfare. Pensions are being squeezed, healthcare is being cut, education is being starved of resources, all to feed a war machine that devours everything in its path. The AI described Russia's economy as a zombie, technically alive but sustained entirely by artificial intervention. Factories producing tanks instead of tractors, workers building missiles instead of infrastructure, an entire nation redirected toward destruction rather than development. This isn't growth, it's consumption of the future to pay for the present. And the cracks are already showing in daily life. Inflation officially hit 9.5% by late 2024, but anyone shopping for groceries knows the real number is significantly higher. Eggs, butter, basic staples, prices have surged far beyond what official statistics admit. The central bank's 21% interest rate has made borrowing nearly impossible for small businesses and ordinary families trying to buy homes or start companies. Home prices have tripled since 2020, creating a real estate bubble that threatens to burst catastrophically. Between July and September 2025, Russians withdrew 659 billion rubles in cash from banks, nearly 5 times the amount during the same period the year before. Trust in the financial system is eroding fast. Putin can claim economic victory all he wants, but Russian mothers struggling to afford milk for their children know the truth. The prosperity is a mirage, and it's flickering. So the economy is warping under pressure. The workers are vanishing. The births have cratered. But the AI's prediction hinged on something most experts have ignored entirely: the fractures within Russia itself. Here's a truth that gets buried under headlines about Putin's strongman image. Russia isn't really one country. It's 89 regions and 21 ethnic republics stitched together by a combination of money, fear, and force. And that stitching is starting to come apart at the seams. Ethnic Russians make up about 72% of the population, but that percentage is declining year by year. In places like Tatarstan, Tatars constitute over half the population. In Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ingushetia, ethnic Russians are tiny minorities. Yakutia in Siberia is majority Yagut, sitting atop vast diamond and mineral wealth that Moscow has extracted for decades. These regions have their own languages, their own cultures, their own histories of resistance to Russian rule. They've been kept in line through subsidies from Moscow and the ever-present threat of overwhelming force. But both of those levers are weakening as the war drains resources and manpower. The war has exposed the ugly bargain at the heart of Russian federalism. Poor, remote, non-Slavic regions have shouldered a grotesquely disproportionate share of casualties. Bashkortostan and Tatarstan top the verified death counts. Buryatia and Dagestan have suffered far higher losses per capita than wealthy Moscow. These communities are being used as cannon fodder for Putin's imperial ambitions, and they know it. In September 2022, something remarkable happened. As Putin announced his mobilization decree, protests erupted across the North Caucasus. Mothers and wives in Dagestan flooded the streets, shouting "No to war." Police cracked down hard, arresting hundreds, but the message was unmistakable. Resentment in minority regions is reaching a breaking point. These demonstrations were suppressed, but suppressed isn't the same as solved. The anger hasn't gone anywhere, it's just waiting. The Wagner mutiny in June 2023 revealed something even more alarming about the hollowness of Russian power. A private military force seized the major city of Rostov-on-Don and raced toward Moscow, virtually unopposed. They got within 200 kilometers of the capital before standing down. Putin's vaunted security apparatus couldn't stop them. His military, bogged down in Ukraine, couldn't respond. The so-called second most powerful army in the world couldn't even defend its own heartland from a mercenary rebellion. Consider Tatarstan's history for a moment. In 1992, it was the last republic to sign Russia's Federation Treaty, and only after extracting significant autonomy concessions. Tatarstan has its own language and its own cultural identity, its own oil reserves that Moscow has exploited for decades. When Putin systematically stripped away regional autonomy starting in 2000, Tatars didn't forget. They simply waited for circumstances to change. Or look at Chechnya, where Russia fought 2 devastating wars that killed tens of thousands of civilians. The current peace is a transaction. Kadyrov's loyalty purchased with money and impunity to run his fiefdom as he sees fit. But transactions can always be renegotiated. And when Moscow can no longer pay, Kadyrov will calculate his next move very differently. The AI's analysis was stark. Russia has never truly been a nation-state. It's an empire held together by coercion. And empires don't decline gracefully. When the center weakens, the edges break away. Those fractures are already forming. The regions are restless. The economy is cracking. The military is bleeding out. But the AI's answer ultimately came down to one final vulnerability: the man attempting to hold it all together through sheer force of will. Vladimir Putin built his entire system on the projection of strength. The strongman who restored order after the chaos of the 1990s. The leader who crushed Chechen separatists, who seized Crimea without firing a shot, who defied the West and got away with it. For 2 decades, that image held Russia together. Fear of Putin meant fear of challenging the system he created. But the Wagner mutiny shattered something fundamental that cannot be repaired. A warlord captured a major Russian city in mere hours, when the Russian army had spent months failing to capture far smaller Ukrainian towns. Putin was forced to negotiate with a man who had openly called his defense minister a traitor. He looked weak, he looked scared, he looked replaceable. That perception, once lost, never fully returns. Since then, the Kremlin has been consumed by paranoia and internal purges. Waves of dismissals have swept through the military and security services as Putin's inner circle hunts for traitors and disloyal elements. Prigozhin died in a mysterious plane crash exactly 2 months after the mutiny, a brutal message to anyone else considering defiance. But fear only works when people believe in your power, and that belief is eroding with every passing month. Putin is now in his 70s, and the question of succession looms over everything like a shadow. There is no clear heir apparent, no designated replacement, no mechanism for peaceful transition of power. If Putin dies suddenly, whether from illness, assassination, or simply old age, the system faces a power vacuum that could trigger exactly the kind of elite infighting that collapsed the Soviet Union. If he clings to power too long, the rot only accelerates. Decision-making paralyzed by an aging autocrat surrounded by yes-men too terrified to tell him the truth. History offers a stark warning here. Russian governments have collapsed after military disasters before. The Russo-Japanese War in 1905 sparked revolution that nearly toppled the Tsar. World War I led directly to 1917 and the complete destruction of the Romanov dynasty. Defeat in Afghanistan accelerated the Soviet Union's final unraveling. If Ukraine pushes Russian forces back decisively, or if Putin is forced into a peace agreement seen as surrender, the consequences could be catastrophic for the regime. Hardliners might revolt against what they see as betrayal. The public's quiet acquiescence might transform into open rage. Elite factions might finally make their move. The man who built a throne on fear now lives in fear himself, and that's exactly when empires become most dangerous and most vulnerable. So here's what the AI predicted would happen next. The scenario that emerged from the data was chilling in its plausibility. The collapse unfolds in stages. First, the war drags on without clear victory. International pressure continues to tighten. A successful Ukrainian operation shocks the Russian public by retaking territory Moscow had claimed was permanently annexed. Discontent, long suppressed beneath the surface, begins to emerge into the open. Then comes the trigger. Maybe it's a sudden oil price collapse as the world transitions away from fossil fuels. Maybe it's a new round of sanctions that finally breaks the banking system. Maybe it's simply the cumulative weight of everything: the deaths, the deficits, the despair. Whatever the spark, the ruble enters free fall. Banks freeze withdrawals to prevent a run. Pensions go unpaid across entire regions. The social contract that kept Russians quiet for 2 decades, stability in exchange for obedience, disintegrates overnight. In Moscow, the scramble for power begins immediately. With Putin incapacitated, absent, or simply unable to maintain control, factions within the security services turn on each other. The FSB against military intelligence. Rival generals backing different potential successors. What starts as political maneuvering behind closed doors turns violent in the streets. And while Moscow burns, the regions make their move. Chechnya's Ramzan Kadyrov declares his forces will maintain order independently until stability returns to Moscow. It's succession dressed in careful diplomatic language, but everyone understands what it means. Dagestan and Ingushetia follow suit, local militias and nationalist groups filling the vacuum left by departing federal troops. Tatarstan's parliament convenes emergency sessions, voting to assume sovereign powers until constitutional order is restored. Bashkortostan joins them within days. Turkey and Central Asian states move quickly to recognize these new Turkic brother nations, emerging from the wreckage. In Siberia, governors don't bother declaring independence. They simply stop taking orders from a capital that can no longer enforce them. A Siberian Emergency Council forms to manage fuel and food supplies, since Moscow has abandoned any pretense of governance. Officials in Vladivostok reach out to China for economic assistance to keep their region functioning. The Far East slides quietly but inevitably into Beijing's orbit. The world watches in disbelief as maps are redrawn in real time. International organizations scramble to respond to a crisis no one is prepared for. The UN debates peacekeeping missions with no clear mandate. NATO quietly secures the perimeter around Kaliningrad, the isolated Russian exclave on the Baltic, terrified of loose nuclear weapons falling into uncertain hands. Kazakhstan and Finland close their borders to prevent spillover chaos from consuming their own territories. And in Moscow, whatever rump government remains controls little beyond the capital and its immediate surroundings. A shadow of an empire that once stretched across 11 time zones. It sounds dramatic, almost fantastical. But remember this, just a few years before the Soviet Union fell, almost no expert predicted its dissolution. In 1989, the Eastern Bloc looked permanent, eternal, unmovable. By 1991, it was gone, dissolved largely peacefully into 15 new independent countries. The Russian Federation's fracturing, if it happens, might not be so peaceful, but it's no longer unthinkable. The AI's analysis simply followed current trajectories to their local conclusion. None of the factors we've discussed were invented or exaggerated. Every statistic came from verified sources. Russian government data, independent researchers, Western intelligence assessments. The population is shrinking at an accelerating rate. The war is causing immense and irreversible strain. The economy is warping under impossible pressures. The regions have deep historical grievances that never disappeared. The leader is aging without a succession plan. Each crisis feeds and amplifies the others, and empires throughout history have fallen when multiple failures converged simultaneously. The Carnegie Endowment called Russia's demographic crisis its most dangerous yet. The Small Wars Journal warned of cascading human capacity problems that compound over time. Analysts have described Russia as a human volcano about to explode. These aren't fringe voices or wishful thinking from Russia's enemies. They're serious researchers examining the same data the AI analyzed. For the world, Russia's dissolution would be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it could end a major source of global aggression and open opportunities for freedom in places long suppressed by Moscow's imperial ambitions. On the other hand, the process could be chaotic and extraordinarily dangerous. A nuclear-armed state fragmenting into competing factions raises nightmares about loose weapons and rogue commanders that keep intelligence agencies awake at night. The transition would require careful international management, something the world isn't particularly good at. But here's the truth the AI made absolutely clear. Whether or not full dissolution happens, Russia is on a trajectory that cannot continue indefinitely. You cannot lose over 1 million casualties and call it a victory. You cannot record your lowest births in 2 centuries and call it stability. You cannot drain your reserves, alienate your brightest citizens, and sacrifice your future for a war your own soldiers are dying to escape, and expect the system to hold together forever. The empire won't explode in a single dramatic moment. It will dissolve. Slowly at first, then all at once. And this time, we all get a front row seat to watch it happen. So, what do you think? Will Russia somehow muddle through these crises? Or are we watching the early stages of another imperial dissolution? Let us know in the comments, and if this video opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered before, Subscribe to Fall of Nations for more analysis on how the world's powers rise, stumble, and fall.